Hi, welcome everyone to our lunchtime session of CME Palooza Spring. I am Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza, and I would like to welcome you to our session. This session is entitled The Intersection Between Information, Knowledge, and Practice, and this is a session sponsored by Daiichi Sankyo. Our moderator for this session is John Ruggiero. John is the head of medical external affairs and the director of grants and education at Daiichi Sankyo. So a few housekeeping slides before we get started. First of all, I would like to thank our sponsors, all of our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Daiichi Sankyo, Academic CME, and Physicians Education Resource. Our silver sponsors, Peer Audience, Clinical Care Options, and Practicing Clinicians Exchange, and Medscape Education. And all of our bronze sponsors, PVI, Catalyst Medical Education, CMEology, the Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning, Vindico Medical Education, Paradigm Medical Communications, Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, Global Education Group, CE Outcomes, Integrity CE, RMEI, Helio CME, Infograph Ed, Med Learning Group, Primary Care Network, Prova Education, Red Med Ed, the letter V, and the number 6. So here's how to ask questions during this and all of our CME Palooza Spring sessions. For those folks who are watching us live, you can use the Peer Audience text line to send in a question to 267-666-0CME, that's 0263. You can also tweet your question to us using the CME Palooza hashtag. So please note that the perspectives of our speakers do not purport to reflect the opinions or views of their organization or their associates. And what is recommended during today's discussion is not meant to recommend a new outcomes practice or disregard all the contributions to outcomes models or projects. So essentially, I think this is the don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to John to get us started.
Scott, first of all, thank you so much to you and Derek and to the whole entire CME Palooza community for allowing us to have this opportunity with you and those who are participating today. The fact that we're in uncertain times right now really leads a lot of different organizations to think through their strategies and determine what is the appropriate practice to put forward in order to get business moving or to eventually maybe even pause business if necessary. The fact that you're still having CME Palooza today demonstrates the fact that educational gaps continue. Educational gaps need to be closed. Clinicians are calling on us to lead this effort and to supply them with practice opportunities to address. And we just really appreciate the fact that you're still having CME Palooza in general. And as you said, we share these perspectives as supporters of independent medical education. And those perspectives are not necessarily purported to recommend what our organization feels or even the associates of our organization. So thank you for really illustrating as well that we're not intending to have this be a new outcomes model. It's just a thought process, if you will, on what is necessary to get that moment in time when information suddenly transforms into practice change. And we're hoping to provide these perspectives, our perspectives alone. You could agree with them, you may not, but at least there are perspectives to at least start a conversation. And if we can pause here for just one moment on this slide, I'm honored today to be joined by some of my colleagues who have all ranges of experience from clinical work to agency work, to various scientific work, in addition to their involvement in continued medical education, medical information and communications, and even clinical professional development. And each of them will be able to briefly introduce themselves as I begin to ask them questions. But prior to going into that, I think it's better to first at least help you understand where we as an industry participant might be focused. And if we can go to the next slide. First, I think you understand that most of our organizational CME departments sit within a medical affairs structure. Medical affairs exists as a section of the industry to accelerate evidence into best personalized practice so that outcomes can show an impact on patient lives. That's why we do what we do every single day. And repeatedly every year, when physicians are asked about opportunities that allow them to make the most appropriate decision for their patients, typically around 70% of physicians see continued professional development opportunities as a means to address just that. So our point here is, why not aim there if our medical affairs mission is to accelerate best evidence into practice? Especially when my purview and my colleagues' purview on this webinar today is not overselling products, but instead exposing patients and their physicians and allied health clinicians to all evidence that may be available lists of options for them to get them to their personalized needs. We also want to help clinicians face their deficiencies and adopt tools that make their lessons relevant to their practice needs. And it's very important that we start focusing on what the market is demanding in order to make the most appropriate decisions for either designing education, if you're providers of education, or supporting education, if you are the supporter. So if we go to the next slide, I thought it might be helpful to provide context on what makes good CME or interprofessional continued development. And in order to address that, it's probably best to understand the trends first. Now, before COVID even became a topic of conversation in a regular matter or daily basis, we were entering an era of digitized medicine. And in the health system side of things, they are developing new business models to drive new ideas in order to address new metrics that they're mandated to meet these days. And in a world that's demanding big data, we need to understand that health data is pervasive and it requires new tools and clinical models. The pharma enterprise on our side of the industry is a configuration that is moving our business shift from volume of products sold to value of the impact we are making in specific disease states of interest. And as a result, healthcare is quickly transforming into models that may mirror streaming services. So think Netflix and Hulu for healthcare. And professional education, therefore, is transforming into skill building. And national policies will start to consider their implication on public health in every aspect of a national policy conversation. Don't forget as well that often when we talk about educational design, or we start discussing outcomes that result from the education, we are also trying to not forget that confidence is a major outcome metric that we should try to adhere to. We are constantly, and I thank people like Stephen Hamowitz and other providers who generally parrot this information, which I'm just parroting based on what I've learned from them. We're constantly asking an overextended profession to complete education that adds time to their already overextended day, while also, maybe unconsciously, sometimes judging their knowledge and their skills levels. So therefore, what might be good? And if we could advance to the next slide, that would be very helpful. Our learners are adults. They like to hear leaders' perspectives. But all adults, while they need structure, also need room for disruption. So perhaps a list of objectives is only as good as the purpose behind them. Consider benchmark data, for example, as a means to show clinicians the purpose behind a program in the first place, the problem that they are facing because of this benchmark issue, and then more importantly, what will happen if it is not addressed. And so I think in order for us to really understand the form of programs that learners may need at this time, outcomes should truly reflect the real world challenges. So for example, how can we bring forth knowledge and measure the acquisition of that knowledge, then perhaps measure the attitudes before providing skills in order to train clinicians to the appropriate level of where they need their deficiencies met, and then measure those skills against the baselines, and then absolutely observe behavior over a period of time in order to measure the relevant performance change. And this is really the crux of our conversation today. So I'm going to begin my questioning of some of my colleagues. And first, I'm going to go to James. And James, perhaps maybe first you can briefly introduce yourself to the community. And then after you do so, help us understand, in your opinion, what types of programs you think are suited or best suited for knowledge as an endpoint to an educational program.
Sure. Hello, everyone. As John mentioned, my name is James Nam, and I'm a manager of medical information and education at Daiichi Sankyo, and I particularly support the solid tumor franchise. Yeah, John, thanks for the question. I believe that measuring an improvement in knowledge is the best end result, probably for programs that are looking to address deficiencies in facts and concepts. For instance, this is especially important when clinicians need to be kept up to date on emerging information and when relevant data, is published or made available. Knowledge isn't a measure for when most important outcome is that someone needs to be aware of something, and we should remember that knowledge is also the theoretical or practical understanding of a subject as a groundwork for all gap closures. In my experience, the best knowledge-based educational programs use tools like, evaluation of data and other real-world evidence, and the recall and recognition that something was learned. We should all remember that knowledge is also familiarity gained by experience of facts or situations.
James, it's really helpful to understand, and if I'm understanding you correctly, it's a lot about recall and a lot about trying to appropriately design a program where information is needing to be absorbed.
Mm-hmm.
In that respect, what do you think might be the best way for the educational community to measure whether knowledge has been acquired? And then perhaps, why is measuring knowledge so important in your mind?
Sure. I think the best way to capture that is some sort of documentation. That really reflects the learner's ability to demonstrate what they've learned. And that's probably the best way to measure knowledge. Some tools that we can utilize are survey post-tests, documenting responses to case studies, or even identifying, what the participant actually learned in addition. And as a result, what was the knowledge gap that they had from learning from this program. Capturing something like this is so important, but it's not done all the time. So kudos to the programs that actually do it. In terms of why knowledge is so important, modern medical practices use education to keep a healthcare provider up to date. So they have the ability to, even do stuff like rationalize an appropriate care plan and even argue for each step in the right direction for the patient's benefit. It only makes sense that everyone in the educational community would want to focus on knowledge of some kind. Knowledge is the final, sometimes knowledge is the final endpoint. And other times, I think, as you'll see today, knowledge is just the cornerstone of something more.
James, this is really helpful. Thank you for the background as well as for the perspectives that you have related to knowledge. Everybody understand how you came into industry, if you don't mind. What was your path into the position that you now hold?
Sure. I had a pretty roundabout way to industry, actually. I had a bunch of different experiences, starting from independent pharmacies as a retail pharmacist into big box retail pharmacy, and then managed care. I worked as a clinical operations manager for Express Scripts for a couple of years. And then I became a medical writer where I developed the skills to, produce medical content. And I joined, Daiichi, and I also worked at BMS previously.
And would it be safe to assume that you are a practicing clinician, therefore, and also required to take these educational activities and have a perspective because of that?
Well, yeah, for sure. I definitely still work as a retail pharmacist, even though I have joined the industry. I actually loved working with patients and providing direct patient care. So that's something I still do regularly when it's available, when I have the time, of course. But yes, education is really crucial, especially even from a retail setting. Like, there's so many new advances, not just in terms of clinical data or clinical information, but in terms of patient care and knowledge for me from a regulatory perspective. So yeah, continuing education is so critical.
Well, thank you for your perspectives, James. And please obviously stick around because we'll want to rely on some of your opinions later in the program and absolutely be available for questions that might be asked. I think to keep things moving, what I'd like to do is go to Kaylee. Again, very much like we did with James, after briefly introducing yourself, perhaps, again, using your opinion, what type of programs do you think are best suited for attitude change, going from knowledge to then assessing people's attitudes and perhaps even their confidence? Very much like I asked James as well, why do you think measuring attitude changes in educational programs might be so important?
Hi, everybody. I'm Kaylee Lugo, and I also work in the Medical Information and Education Department at James and Kaylee, primarily focused in the solid tumor franchise. And I want to bring everyone back to what you said earlier about confidence. I do believe this is such an important factor in the learning process, and often clinicians will not accept skills building until they've gained some confidence in the data in front of them. Now, for industry, this confidence is not only important to measure in terms of our organization's data, but also all of the current and emerging evidence in the space so that clinicians can really weigh the options for each individual patient they encounter. I believe that attitudes are often the result of emotional connection to facts, and attitudes will lead to the way that we'll eventually behave when faced with a circumstance. I also believe that these attitudes will always come through during patient encounters.
Oh, that's interesting. So, Kaylee, do you think that perhaps when the last statement that you just made about attitudes often coming through patient encounters, is that just a natural human behavior that may eventually come through when a clinician is speaking with a patient that could be focused on a bias that they may have either consciously or subconsciously?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that when clinicians are meeting with patients, it's sometimes they fall back on, thinking about what the status quo is, but I think it's really important to be up to date on information because, the patient might be experiencing something different and unique to them. So I think that, if they have that change of attitude where maybe I could make a change for just this patient, that could be really helpful.
So I'm going to ask you something on the spot. Don't get nervous by this, but you also are a practicing clinician. You have a lot of experience in the clinical world. And if you were to go through an educational program that helped to address attitudes, if you will, do you think you would be open to that or would you be resistant to it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as a pharmacist, we complete continuing education credits as well. And I think measuring attitudes is definitely a creative way to do something different. And I think that's definitely something that would be really important.
Okay. Well, then with that, what do you think the best way that the educational community might measure a learner's attitude toward education or towards what's being discussed in the education? And then maybe also too, why do you think measuring a learner's attitude is so important?
Yeah, I think this is challenging, but fortunately we are part of an educational community with educational designers who are thinking about this very question and are working to innovatively design programs to do this. And from my perspective, it would be interesting to see the documented evidence around a learner's commitment to take the knowledge they learned into some sort of practice change result. But I think it would also be valuable having them identify the skills they need in order to take them to that final result. I think that if attitudes are misaligned, ultimately that misalignment is going to impact adherence to practice expectations and even compliance. Also, there can be systemic processing of situations set in place by institutions or practices, sort of what I mentioned before, that could standardize care inappropriate for patients and leave them unexposed to up-to-date evidence and resources. And ultimately, this misaligned attitude might also lead to low motivation for change, especially when this change might be very necessary.
Oh, that's interesting. So might you be even suggesting that it may be great to have something that educates people on knowledge information, knowledge acquisition, but if attitudes are not adjusted, there may be therefore a low motivation to actually put that knowledge into some type of practice?
Definitely, definitely. I think that, the attitudes definitely have to be adjusted in order for that change to be made.
That's really fair. Thank you for that perspective. And I'm going to ask you the same thing that I asked James. Can you take us a little bit through a journey of how you got into the position that you now hold? What's the background?
Yeah, so my background is I went to both pharmacy school and business school at the same time. So I hold both a PharmD and an MBA. And that kind of sparked my interest in going into a fellowship. So I took a fellowship position in medical affairs, and then I did that for 2 years, and then joined Daiichi Sankyo in medical information.
Well, we're glad that you're here. Thank you so much for your perspective. Like I said to James, please stick around because we may get some questions and may need to call on you again after that.
So John,
again, yes,
John,
go ahead, Scott.
We actually do have a question, if I can just jump in real quickly. So this came over on Twitter. So are you considering confidence in knowledge and confidence as an attitude here, or are you referring to attitudes related to stages of change or need to change?
Oh, that's a good question, because I think it could be both. And I don't mean to not give an appropriate answer to the questioner. But let's take the first one, for example. Attitudes related to information are really important, because if you have information shared with you, there are at times that information may not be absorbed confidently. Think about what an industry perspective might be. There may be a program that is related to data dissemination, updates in technologies and therapeutic options in a specific disease state or disease class. And the data might be important for clinicians to know, but yet they may see that data and not be very confident to act on it yet until further data is released, or until further questions are addressed, maybe about side effects or other kinds of issues that come with the data that is released. So without that confidence being built, data being shared and information being gained is only one step. You need some confidence indicator in order to ensure that information is going to be used in a practical way. As far as attitudes on stages of change, or confidence in attitudes of stages of change, that's also an equally very interesting topic, which in all fact is a science in itself and could likely have its own session. There are stages of change that people go through in an adult learning model and behavior change theories that require implications to step-by-step processes that allow for people to have those measured results. And so if there is a process in place or a gap in place that requires a stages of change kind of initiative, I think that all of us who are involved in this educational community would really find that important to evaluate. And let me pause too to see if either James or Kaylee have any perspective on attitudes as confidence in knowledge or confidence in stages of change throughout the journey. I'm not sure if you guys are muted, I'm sorry. We start with you, Kaylee. What do you think about what I had just said about the confidence and knowledge that's shared?
Yeah, John, I think you really hit the main points there. I don't know that I necessarily have anything to add at this time, but I think, everything you said is definitely important.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. James, I don't know if you have any perspective, especially because you addressed knowledge itself. We know that knowledge is really important, and there's definite reasons for knowledge to be acquired. But without the confidence, what might you have to add to what I shared?
No, John, I think you really hit most of it on the head. I agree. And knowledge is very important, and attitudes for knowledge really do need to be, addressed, and the community at large needs to understand that the programs and the knowledge that are provided through these programs are really critical and important to retain. So that's definitely a challenge for the industry moving forward, being able to change those attitudes towards knowledge.
Yeah, Yeah, and it requires a lot of deep science, right? Because individuals are interesting beings, right? We try to face issues of confidence constantly in our work environment, and so unconsciously or consciously, we have barriers that limit our ability to improve our confidence in certain things. And so we are definitely looking for educational initiatives that explore confidence at different levels, whether it's confidence in information or confidence through the entire journey of the stage of attitude building.
Absolutely.
Scott, let me ask before I go forward, is there another question that you think is relevant to that topic that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, so there's one more question that just came over on the peer audience text line. So here's the question. How do you incorporate behavioral science in more subtle ways to encourage measurable and objective behavioral change within the context of a traditional independent medical education intervention?
That is a great question. And maybe we pause on that because we're actually going to discuss behavioral changes in the upcoming section. Okay.
Great.
All right. Perfect. So why don't I go ahead and advance to Gopi, thanking again James and Kaylee for their perspectives. And Gopi, very similar to what I just asked James and Kaylee to do, perhaps briefly introduce yourself and then your opinion. Maybe you could take us to the next step, the step of skills building. Once attitudes have been addressed, because knowledge was addressed, skills building. Why? What types of programs, would be important or suited for skills building as an end result?
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Gopi Krishnan, and I'm a manager in the Medical Information and Education Department at Daiichi Sankyo as well, supporting products in the hematology and the solid tumor franchises. So great question, John. But in my perspective, when it comes to skills building, I think it's important to remember that educational programs really are shifting towards a skills-based problem-solving method and not just lectures alone anymore. So this is where I believe everything is moving towards in the future, and we're honestly seeing some of that with the COVID-19 implications currently. So we define a skill as an ability to perform a task, or anything that is essentially skills-based would need to have a way to measure the learner's ability both prior to and after an educational event. So we know that a skill leads to expertise and especially applies to the practice setting, where in order to achieve proficiency in practice, a skill needs to be initially taught and in some instances even retaught. So I believe that skills are often followed by various how-to statements. For example, how to diagnose, or even how to use new data in a new way that is most relevant for patients, or how to even appropriately diagnose an adverse event.
Sorry about that, Gopi. I was on mute and was already starting.
That's okay.
Yeah, so this is really interesting, right? Because I especially like the guidance that you just gave to the educational community here on what a skill kind of outcome might look like. It usually starts with the how-to statements, right? How to diagnose an adverse event, how to do something more appropriately, which I think is absolutely leading to the kinds of skills that people need to address. So then with that, what do you think is the best way to measure a learner's skills improvement? And why might you think that's really important for the educational community right now?
Sure. So I believe in anything that measures the precision of a specific technique. So the educational community can measure a learner's skill improvement through case studies, but also through observation, for example, self or peer observation. But this also can be done through the creation of a network of cases where, for example, a peer can offer input, or through educational programs which create a rubric of some kind to define an exceptional, acceptable, or even an unacceptable demonstration of a certain skill. So today, healthcare professionals, I believe, in my opinion, need a much broader range of skills in order to practice according to the expectations of not only patients, government regulations, or even new or growing expectations in order for them to properly collect and utilize the data to show progress in a patient's care plan goals. However, I think a lot of the times these issues are not always the ones that clinicians were initially taught, or even the skills that led them into their profession in the first place. So every clinician is trying to do the right thing while also balancing out all these new expectations that they have. So I believe people with gaps in their skills are often blindsided the first time that they hear that there's even an issue or a problem. And this can definitely impact appropriate care in every way possible, and obviously ultimately himself.
You said something so interesting to me, and I think so important for everybody to hear again, that often the skills that we were asking clinicians to address are not the types of skills that they were taught in the first place, and in the reasons for why they wanted to become clinicians. Do you have any idea on what the kinds of skills are coming up today that clinicians are now facing that they didn't go to school for, if you will? Like, we know technology and gathering big data is important, but thinking about even your own profession, what are the kinds of skills that you're being asked to address now that may not be really what you went to school for?
Sorry, John, there's a little bit of a lag on my end. So just to clarify, if I heard you correctly, the skills that we were taught in the past, the skills that we're hearing or being asked to act upon now, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes, definitely. And I think that is very true of this day and age. Skills are constantly changing on a basis, and the education that we receive in the past can change over the course of time. So what we're taught definitely needs to be retaught with the changing times, with changing treatment landscapes and everything that's going on in the current world.
Sure. Thank you, Gopi. And I know that you're having some technology delays, so thank you for being patient with probably what is something that's being caused by me. I apologize about that. Gopi, if you do have a moment before actually getting knocked off of the Wi-Fi system, perhaps like Kaylee and James did too, what led you into the position that you now hold? What was your journey into this process?
Sure. So my experience was I went to pharmacy school, and after pharmacy school, I had a strong interest in industry. So I decided to pursue a fellowship. But my fellowship was a very interesting experience in that I decided to do a one-year postdoc fellowship in the medical communication setting in an agency. It was a great experience where I had a lot of exposure to different therapeutic regimens and areas in the agency perspective. And after my one-year fellowship and after 1 year in the agency setting, I actually transitioned over to Daiichi Sankyo.
So would it be fair to assume, based on the same assumptions that I made with James and Kaylee, that you've been not only involved in actually being a participant in the kinds of programs that we support for clinicians, but you've actually been behind the scenes and having the ability to design initiatives, applications, or educational initiatives in the past as well?
Yes, definitely. So coming from an agency perspective, it's been a great experience, and I've had the opportunity to help build medical content for several programs, and I think that's been a wonderful experience. And now being able to apply that at Daiichi Sankyo is definitely a wonderful experience as well.
Thank you for that, Gopi. That's really helpful. And I think it's really important, too, the reason why I'm asking these questions of you all, and thank you for being so patient with my questions. I think it's important for the educational community to understand that in the supporter side of this business, we often have people who are making decisions on these grants that are very, very technically savvy on the kinds of things that we're asking you to do. So we respect the fact that educational providers have the expertise of educational design and educational measurement. And we really, really appreciate the fact that you have leadership in those spaces. At the same time, please understand too, any recommendation we make from our perspectives in presentations like this is not based on just what would be nice, according to our opinion, but based on some of the experiences that we've had as well. And so thank you for sharing that perspective, Gopi. Please stick around if you can, but obviously if there's a technology issue, we understand if you have to drop off. But I'd like to go over to Kristen, and this is very relevant in the last question that we received about behavior change, because we think that that might be the next step. Once you identify knowledge, and then you're able to build in attitude changes according to confidence from that knowledge, then perhaps address skills that need to be addressed because of deficiencies that were identified. The next logical step in the science of behavior change would be behavior change. and behavior change leading into performance or practice changes. So ultimately, Kristen, maybe after introducing yourself, can you help us understand what type of programs you think, in your opinion, are best for behavior and performance change?
Sure, John, absolutely. My name is Kristen Sarlo, and I support our U.S. Medical Affairs Department at Daiichi Sankyo, both in our Medical Information and Education Department, and then recently in our Medical Research and Strategy team. So in regards to what types of programs are best suited for behavior or performance changes measurables, I think it's important that we first level set on what behavior means in regards to when we're talking about medical education specifically. Let me give you some examples. This could be starting or continuing a positive habit. It could be working with clear end goals in mind, perhaps deciding to take an evidence-based risk to personalize someone's care. I would even say managing time efficiently to balance needs for interprofessional team alongside patient care. And finally, I think we could consider a commitment to learning. All of these are behaviors that I would say are a roadmap to potentially having eventually performance change. So what types of programs are best suited for behavior as an end result? I would say that those are the types of activities where our metrics show that educational gaps show that there's lagging or potentially even dangerous performance, such as inequitable care or care that's not consistent with guidelines or evidence-based consensus. And to Kaylee's point earlier, also care that's maybe tied to attitudes that require skills training, because attitudes, as Kaylee mentioned, are often unknowingly biased, right? So we're starting to see, as John mentioned, this is kind of all connected.
Kristen, that's perfect. And I apologize. I'm trying to navigate my screen here to make sure that I'm not speaking while you're speaking, muting myself, and then forgetting to unmute myself. So apologies for that. So I really enjoyed what you shared, because I think the very first important point that we often miss in these kinds of conversations is the fact that we often define things differently across the industry and across the spectrum of what we believe we're speaking about. And you clearly demonstrated something in your first response, which was basically that we need to talk about what behavior means. Behavior for so many of us mean different things, and for clinicians it may mean something even further different. And I think what I heard you say, it's not only starting or continuing some kind of positive habit, but it's having some kind of clear end goal in mind. And that's really important, because without that clear end goal, very much like I said in the introduction, without defining and addressing why something is so important, people are not going to be bought into the educational program in the first place. They need to understand what will result if they do not change something that is addressing the benchmark issue that was faced. So with that said, I'd like to ask you the same thing that I've asked to others. What do you think might be the best way for this educational community to learn from your perspective on how to measure a learner's behavior improvement? And why do you think it's so important that we be even talking about behavior today?
Yeah, thanks, John. And I love what you just said about benchmarks. I think benchmarks is really where we have to begin here. So you start by showing your learners their deficiencies. And I think Gopi mentioned it earlier that a lot of times people are surprised to learn where they're deficient and to learn how their deficiencies are ultimately impacting their clinical practice and their behaviors. So the way that we can continue to measure behavior is to monitor performance for a chunk of time after the event and after educational reinforcements to evaluate the progress that's being made. I think that the subjective willingness to change or the commitment to change is always going to be an important measurable, but monitoring performance through observation is really key. And this can be done through the provider, through the partnering facility, or through the faculty in some way. So I do think that behavior change is a very important measurable that we should be using.
I agree with you. And I think that often we tell educational providers, if you want to measure performance change, you have to observe something, which I agree with. Things have to be observed to see whether or not performance actually really did change. But it doesn't always have to be on the shoulders of the provider, the educational provider. Sometimes it could be through partnerships with the facility. Sometimes the facility would prefer to monitor that. Sometimes the educational provider has really innovative, creative ways to capture the ongoing measure of that performance by using certain learners in a program as pilots, or subjective studies to help them measure that performance goal. And so I really enjoy what you had just said. I'm hoping that perhaps some of the pearls that you shared address some of the question or parts of the question that questioner had. And please, if that did not, text us again and ask us to further elucidate on that, because I think your question was really important. Kristen, if you wouldn't mind sharing with everyone, like the others did, your journey into this space, how you got into it, and what leads you to be passionate about the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. So similar to many of the others, I am a pharmacist by training. I worked as a pharmacy practitioner in oncology clinical care for a while at a major cancer institution before joining the pharmaceutical industry. So I'm very passionate about oncology in particular. And I think that oncology as a space is continuing to evolve, and continuing education is really an area that can provide people with the skills and the knowledge that they need in order to keep up with the changing landscape. So I'm very passionate about oncology, very passionate about how continuing education can allow people to practice hopefully better.
And I think that your passion is demonstrative in the fact that you're not only in the industry side of things, because you are a clinician, you came from a health system where you actually did practice within that health system, and then went into industry, and then started in medical information, that went into medical information and education, now is being tapped in medical strategy to help lead a specific tumor team. In Daiichi Sankyo. I think it demonstrates that some of the pearls that you're providing to the clinical community and to the educational community here today are actually quite relevant for the kinds of things that industry seeks. I don't know if you have anything to say. That wasn't necessarily a question, that was a statement, but I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to close with in addition to what I just said.
No, nothing really else to add. I just think that hopefully we've been able to communicate the diversity on some of the teams that are making these types of decisions about educational opportunities, and to really reflect the passion that goes into the decision making.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you for that. So let me just pause and ask Scott. Scott, do you have any questions you've collected that might be helpful for us to address?
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions that came over the peer audience text line. So here's the first one. So in my experience, this is the person's experience, not my personal experience. In my experience, assessing performance change is time-consuming, expensive, and often does not measure what we're trying to measure. Convince me that it's worth the time and effort to design these sorts of interventions.
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. I don't know if our job today is to convince you. You should convince us on whether or not a performance change initiative is appropriate, because obviously we are really relying on an educational provider community to help us understand what is the gap that you've identified and whether or not that gap should be closed based on the measures that you predict are necessary. I think I can provide some perspective on that question, and then I'll ask Kristen and others to add if they would like. is if it is determined that a performance change initiative is necessary. For example, using some of the examples that others today used, there has been an identified benchmark where a specific system is lower than that benchmark. And they know that as a result of being lower than that benchmark, because of new specific measures that they're being held against, that they are going to be penalized for it. And the penalties are sometimes financial. Sometimes the penalties are not financial, but based on what their patients will have, and whether or not their patients will have confidence in the clinicians that are employed in that system. There may be a need for that health system to change behaviors, even if at the very slightest, to show that they've risen above the benchmark, or at least have come into contact with that benchmark. That's one specific example in a clinical community setting where the benchmark has been deployed. Let's say that there's another more national issue. Maybe it has to do with, maybe we can use COVID-19 as a relevant example right now. And the national issue specifically is around the fact that there is poor performance in clinicians' attitudes when patients present at a health system or at a hospital center or even an emergency setting with feeling ill. And immediately clinicians are starting to think, well, this could be a COVID patient. And suddenly all the subconscious or unconscious biases come to play, and the patient doesn't feel either welcomed into the system or doesn't feel like they're following guidelines, or thinks that they missed some kind of recommendation that's heard on the different programs on TV. There could be a behavior change initiative set forth nationally to show this is the national problem. And the problem is less about information, but in addition to information, it is a need to actually change performance. These are reasons or examples why performance change is, in my mind, suited for a specific educational initiative. One of the participants today, and I can't remember if it was Kristen or Gopi, and I apologize for that, they actually said that at times, sometimes attitude, skills, and behaviors could actually be dangerous to a patient population. If we believe that through a pilot educational program, that there needs to be a specific benchmark addressed because practice is actually impacting public health in a certain way, there's absolutely a need for education to address that. So let me go ahead and pause and see if any one of my colleagues have any perspective on what I just shared, or in addition to what that question asked.
Yeah, John, this is Kristen. I think I'd like to add on to what you said. Completely agree that not necessarily all programs or even all of our metrics point to behavior or performance change being appropriate for all educational opportunities. I think we have to think about, since, the questioner was asking, sometimes resources are limited. We want to think about in which scenario is behavior going to be the best measurable outcome. I think from the company perspective, when you're looking at outcomes of education, if you're not seeing an impact on behavior, it starts to make me wonder, is there some other gap maybe that we're missing, right? Because if you're thinking about a subjective commitment to change, and then the downstream behavior is not matching that, it makes me wonder, okay, well, maybe our physicians have the knowledge and they have the commitment to change, but there's some type of resource or infrastructure that's creating a gap that's making it not possible for them to actually implement that in practice. Maybe it's another group that needs to be educated. Maybe it's the pharmacists or the pathologists or the radiologists or somebody else who needs more education or more knowledge, or perhaps there's a financial barrier. And so that information perhaps could be very valuable to us.
Oh, I completely agree. I think those are really good points. Recognizing through a program that perhaps outcomes are not being met, just like in a clinical trial, perhaps endpoints are not being met, starts to expose whether or not the gap was correct in the first place, and or there's additional gaps that are leading to the reason why an initiative was recommended in the first place. I really like that. As far as the limited resource thing, please hear me. I understand, and this is to the educational provider community, I understand that it sometimes does take an incredible amount of not just financial, but human resources to initiate something that is performance changing. I'm not necessarily speaking about large scale initiatives that require demonstrative, measurable outcomes that get reported into the government to show that the entire nation has changed on a specific issue. Sometimes it's a very methodical step using pilots with one specific system or one specific region. That those pilots can then be published, presented in an abstract format so that there's lessons learned and that those things can be replicated across different regions. So I hear you. I think that this being the start of the conversation is at least a good place to be. Let me see if any of my other colleagues had anything else to add on to what Kristen had said before we go to the next question.
Okay, doesn't look like it. So I'll ask the next question, John. So this is sort of ties into a little bit what you were just talking about when you brought up the COVID-19 example. This is another question that came over the peer audience text line. So can independent medical education be effective to help accelerate skill building in crisis situations? And how can we account for the quality of content in an iterative crisis responsive environment?
Oh, wow, that's a really great question. And perhaps a question that the government right now should be considering. I have a perspective, but let me ask Gopi, you were specifically and very eloquently speaking about skills. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but in response to that question, do you have some thoughts?
I do. So I think we're entering a stage where clinicians' need for education seems to be transforming into a need for skills. So we're at this phase with COVID-19 where it's very new to us and we need to really tackle these deficiencies. And I think the educational community has been discussing this for a very long time. And it's forcing us really to adapt to the current and long-term needs of the community and trying to figure out new ways to do business, especially educational business. So I think trying to figure out a method in order to help clinicians, physicians, and every healthcare professional build upon these skills in a very short-term period is extremely crucial and very important.
And I agree with that. And perhaps maybe to add on to that, if I understand parts of the question or elements of the question correctly, can everything be done right now in crisis mode? I mean, we as individuals, we respond often to crises with emotion, because we're human beings. That's how that it's innate within us. And obviously, sometimes emotional responses require quick things or quick fixes. I think what health systems clinicians who are in the front line of this are trying to do is address things step by step. First, it was the lack of supplies to keep them safe. Next, it was the appropriate amount of testing. And next, there will be another issue. And taking things step by step to at least make demonstrative but minute changes bit by bit is probably the most appropriate way to handle a crisis with education. But that is just one perspective. And I wonder if anybody else on the line has other perspectives.
You know, I will just say, this is Kristen speaking, I will just say one thing about, I think the questioner was asking also about maintaining the educational quality during the time period. And I think that we need to think about quality both in terms of the format of the program. In a crisis situation, you want to make it easy for the learners to get access to the program and also to hopefully not create any additional undue stress on them to get the information that you want to provide them. I think in terms of maintaining integrity and quality of the content, sometimes that does become difficult in a crisis situation where we're learning every day. And so sometimes maybe the content that you prepare, a week later, there's additional evidence that's available that either further supports what you've created or perhaps challenges it. And I think we all just have to remember to try to be flexible and that it's a fluid, evolving situation.
I agree, Kristen. First of all, thank you for mentioning that, because this was one of the ways that I was going to summarize the end by bringing everybody back to one of the initial things that I discussed, which was the fact, and we've heard this from other educational providers, I mentioned Stephen Hamowitz as one, that we often ask people to do things and they're already overextended. They're especially overextended right now during COVID-19. And so one of the things that you all need to hear is really me mimicking what Kristen just said at Daiichi Sankyo. And I know that there's other supporters. We're very committed to pursuing the support of education during this time and in other times. But we're also remaining very flexible. We understand that things are changing on a regular basis. In oncology, which is where we're focused, things change rapidly as it is, even outside of COVID-19. So we're trying to really demonstrate two things to you, and we will continue doing this. Number one, we're so honored to ever be considered supporters of your initiatives. And while not everything can be supported, whether it's by Daiichi Sankyo or other supporters, we're still honored that you consider us to be a supporter of your initiative. And number two, we're remaining incredibly flexible when possible. We're remaining incredibly flexible to the fact that some things will be changed or updated as time moves forward, even during a program. So we are basically at time. Scott, perhaps if there's other questions and you make it available to us, we could always document our answers to that if you wanted to share that with the community. But I'll pause and go back over to you and thank my colleagues for joining me today.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you very much to John, to everyone else on this panel. We were having a problem earlier today with our survey link, but it seems to be corrected now. So for folks who are watching this session either live or the archive version, there is a survey link at the top of the live tab. It's very short, but it kind of helps us plan for the future of CME Palooza. And for those of you who are watching this live, our next session will begin momentarily. So once this session is over, you will just need to go in to refresh your browser. So with that, I'd like to thank John and Kristen and Kaylee and James and Gopi for joining us today, and to wish everyone a safe and happy afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.